Vesna hadn't meant to eavesdrop on the Alpha King. She certainly hadn't meant to press herself flat against the stone corridor outside his war room, her pulse hammering so loudly she was convinced the guards 3 halls over could hear it. But the door had been left ajar, just a sliver, and his voice had carried through the gap with that low, deliberate authority that made the air itself hold still. He was describing a woman, not just any woman, his mate. The one he intended to choose at the bonding ceremony in 3 days' time, the event the entire kingdom of Valdemir had been preparing for since the winter thaw. Every eligible noblewoman in the realm had arrived at Ironholt Castle with gowns and perfumes and carefully rehearsed smiles, each one desperate to become the queen beside Cale Ashenmere. Vesna was not one of them. She was the castle's record keeper, a glorified clerk who catalogued grain shipments and tallied tax ledgers, and occasionally mended torn maps when the cartographer was too drunk to hold a pen. She had no business being in this corridor except that Councillor Moret had sent her to deliver revised border reports, and she'd arrived at precisely the wrong moment. Or perhaps the right one. "She won't come from nobility," Cale said, and something in his tone made Vesna's feet refuse to move. "I don't want someone who was trained for this. Someone who rehearsed how to stand beside a throne." A pause. Duvain, the king's first beta and closest advisor, spoke carefully. "Your Majesty, the noble houses will expect— I know what they expect." The king's voice was quiet but absolute, the kind of quiet that preceded storms. "I'm telling you what I need. Someone who sees things others miss, who pays attention to what's actually happening in a room instead of performing for it." Vesna's breath caught. She pressed closer to the wall, her cheek against the cold stone. "Someone steady," Cale continued. "Patient, the kind of person who listens before she speaks and remembers what she hears, who carries herself without pretense." Another pause, longer this time. "Whose hands are always stained with ink because she works harder than anyone asks her to." The world tilted. Vesna looked down at her fingers. The dark smudge of iron gall ink curved across her right thumb and index finger, embedded beneath her nails, staining the creases of her knuckles. It never fully washed out. She scrubbed every evening, and by mid-morning her hands looked the same, marked by the work she did in the archive room from dawn until the candles burned to nothing. "You've just described half the scribes in the kingdom," Duvain said, but there was a careful edge beneath his humor. "No," Cale replied. "I've described one person." Vesna stopped breathing entirely. She should leave. She should turn around, walk back down the corridor, deliver the reports later, pretend she had never heard any of this. Because the king could not possibly be talking about her. She was no one. An orphan raised in the castle's lower quarters, given work because Mistress Orabel, the head healer who also managed the household staff, had insisted she was too clever to waste on laundry. Vesna had no family name, no bloodline, no standing whatsoever in the hierarchy of wolves that governed Valdemir. She was invisible by design and by necessity, and she had made peace with that years ago. But his words kept echoing. Steady, patient, ink-stained hands. Her heart was doing something violent and dangerous inside her chest. She was being ridiculous. There had to be dozens of women in this castle who matched that description. Hundreds, even. It was a coincidence. A projection born of the loneliness she never admitted to, and the way her gaze sometimes followed the king across the great hall without her permission, tracing the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders that never fully eased. She did not have feelings for the Alpha King. That would be insane. Footsteps inside the room, heavy, coming closer. Vesna bolted. She turned and fled down the corridor, the border report still clutched to her chest, her sandals slapping against stone. She rounded the corner and nearly collided with a serving girl carrying a tray of wine goblets. The girl yelped. Vesna caught the tray with one hand, steadied the girl with the other, and kept moving without breaking stride. She didn't stop until she reached the archive room at the bottom of the East Tower. She shut the door, pressed her back against it, and slid to the floor. Her hands were shaking. The reports were crumpled against her chest. She could still hear his voice in her head, low and certain, describing someone who sounded exactly like her, but could not possibly be her, because things like that did not happen to people like Vesna. She pressed her ink-stained fingers to her face and tried to breathe. 3 days until the bonding ceremony. 3 days until the king would stand before the assembled noble houses and choose his queen. And Vesna, who had never wanted anything for herself in 23 years of careful, quiet existence, realized with dawning horror that she wanted him to mean her. She wanted it so badly it terrified her. That night, she dreamed he called her name in front of the entire court, and she woke with tears on her face and a hollow ache behind her ribs that she couldn't explain away. The bonding ceremony was tomorrow. Chapter 1. The great hall of Ironholt had been transformed. Thousands of candles burned in iron chandeliers, casting warm amber light across stone walls draped with the Ashenmere banner, a silver wolf on a field of black. The scent of pine and cedar filled the air, traditional purifying herbs meant to honor the bond about to be formed. Every noble house in Valdemere had sent representatives. They filled the hall in silks and furs, their laughter too loud, their smiles too sharp, their eyes tracking the empty throne with predatory attention. Vesna stood near the back wall, half hidden behind a column, a ledger in her hands. She was supposed to be recording attendance. Instead, she was trying not to vomit. She hadn't slept. The overheard conversation had burrowed into her mind like a splinter. Steady, patient, ink-stained hands. The hall fell silent. Vesna looked up. Cale Ashenmere entered from the far doors, and the sheer physical force of him stole the breath from the room. Tall, broad across the shoulders, his dark hair falling across his forehead. His jaw set in that hard, unreadable line she'd memorized without meaning to. His eyes, pale gray and sharp as broken glass, swept the hall with controlled precision. He looked like a man walking toward something he didn't want. Duvain followed 2 steps behind, his expression carefully neutral. The beta's gaze moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone cataloging threats. And for one brief, electric moment, his eyes found Vesna's behind the column. She looked away immediately, her face burning. The king reached the raised platform at the head of the hall and turned to face the assembly. He did not sit on the throne. He stood beside it, his hands clasped behind his back, and the silence that followed was so complete Vesna could hear the candle flames hissing in their iron cradles. "I will speak plainly," Cale said. His voice carried without effort, filling the hall the way his presence filled a room, completely and without apology. The tradition of this ceremony calls for a formal declaration, a name, a house, a lineage to bind with mine. The noble families leaned forward. Lady Thessaly Greymarch, the most prominent candidate, stood near the front in a gown of deep emerald, her auburn hair swept into an elaborate arrangement of braids and silver pins. She was stunning, poised, the obvious choice. Her father controlled the northern border territories and had been angling for this match since before the Mountain Wars ended. Kyle's gaze moved across the room, past the noble families, past the advisors and generals and wealthy merchants, past Lady Thessaly, who straightened almost imperceptibly as his eyes crossed her face. His gaze stopped. On the column where Vesna stood. On Vesna. The world contracted to the space between his eyes and hers. She felt pinned, exposed, like he'd peeled back the stone she'd been hiding behind and found her crouching in the dark. Her mouth went dry. Her fingers tightened on the ledger until the leather creaked. He looked away. "The woman I choose," Cale continued, and his voice had roughened slightly, just enough that Vesna noticed, "Will not come from among the assembled houses." The silence shattered into murmurs. Lady Thessaly's composure flickered. Duvain closed his eyes briefly, the expression of a man who had warned his king and been overruled. "She is already here," Kale said. "She has served this castle faithfully and without recognition. She is not of noble birth, and I am aware of what that means for this court and for the alliances we've built." His jaw tightened. "But a bond is not a political arrangement. It is not a transaction, and I will not stand here and pretend to choose someone my wolf doesn't recognize." The murmurs became a roar. Voices overlapped, sharp with outrage and confusion. Lord Greymarch's face had gone the color of old brick. Lady Thessaly stood perfectly still, her expression frozen in something between shock and fury. Vesna couldn't move. Her legs had stopped working. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She watched the king's mouth form the next words, and some part of her knew what was coming before the sound reached her ears. "Vesna," Kale said. Just her name. No title, no house, no lineage. Just the word itself, spoken into the stunned silence of the great hall like a stone dropped into still water. Every head in the room turned toward her. Vesna stood behind her column with a ledger in her ink-stained hands and 200 pairs of eyes on her skin, and she did the only thing her body would allow. She ran. The ledger hit the floor. She pushed through the side door and fled down the corridor. She heard shouting behind her, heard her name called by Duvain, sharp and urgent. She didn't stop. She made it to the kitchens before he caught her. Duvain appeared in the doorway, barely winded, his expression a mixture of exasperation and something almost like sympathy. "You can't run from a royal declaration," Duvain said. "Watch me," Vesna replied, her voice shaking. "Refusing publicly would be a grave insult to the crown." "I didn't ask to be named." She pressed her trembling hands flat against the kitchen table. "He doesn't even know me." Duvain studied her. "He knows you better than you think," the beta said quietly. Vesna shook her head, panic rising. "This is a mistake. I'm a record keeper. I have ink under my fingernails that won't come out." Her voice cracked. "I am not queen material." "And yet," Duvain said, "you're the only person in that hall who wasn't trying to be chosen." The words landed like a blow. Vesna stared at him, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. "He won't force you," Duvain said, his tone softening slightly. "If you refuse, he'll accept it. But he's asking you to come back. To let him explain." The beta paused. "Will you?" Vesna pressed her hands to her face. She thought about his voice through the cracked door. The certainty in it. The loneliness beneath the certainty that she'd recognized because it sounded exactly like her own. "Where is he?" she asked. "He won't force you," Duvain said, his tone softening. "If you refuse, he'll accept it. But he's asking you to come back, to let him explain." Vesna closed her eyes. Every rational part of her brain screamed to walk away. Go back to the archive. Go back to the ledgers and the ink and the quiet, invisible life she'd built. But her wolf, dormant and docile for 23 years, stirred beneath her skin for the first time, and it pulled her toward him like a tide she couldn't fight. "Take me to him," she said. Chapter 2. Duvain led her not back to the great hall, but through a narrow servants' passage and up a winding stair to a small private study lined with maps. A fire burned low in the grate. Kyle stood by the window, his back to the door, his coat discarded. Without it, she could see the tension locked in his shoulders. He looked like a man bracing for impact. He turned when the door opened, and the expression on his face made Vesna's chest ache. Relief and dread, and something raw she had never seen on the face of a king. "You came back," he said. Duvain is very persuasive, Vesna replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. He is? Silence settled between them. Vesna gripped her hands together, acutely aware of the plain wool dress she wore, of her rough hands while somewhere downstairs, Lady Thessaly Greymarch smelled like jasmine and political advantage. I heard you, Vesna said. The words came out before she could stop them. 2 days ago, outside the war room. Kale went very still. Ink-stained hands. Vesna said quietly, holding up her fingers. You described someone who listens before she speaks, who carries herself without pretense. Were you describing me? The king looked at her hands, at the dark smudges that never fully faded, and something in his expression broke open. Yes, he said. No hesitation, no qualification. Vesna's eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain. Why? Kale took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it. Because I've watched you for 2 years, Vesna. Every morning in the archive room. Every council meeting where you sit in the corner taking notes no one asked for. Notes more detailed and accurate than anything my advisors produce. Every time you correct a supply calculation that would have cost the Treasury thousands and never take credit for it. She stared at him, stunned. I know you eat lunch alone in the East Garden, he continued. I know you read poetry when you think no one is watching. I know you gave your winter coat to the stable boy last year because his was torn and told Orabel you'd lost yours. You noticed all of that? Vesna whispered. The look he gave her was devastating. I notice everything about you, he said. I have tried very hard to stop. It hasn't worked. The fire crackled. Neither of them moved. The distance between them felt enormous and paper-thin at the same time. I'm no one, Vesna said, and her voice broke on the word. I have no name, no family, no standing. Your court will never accept me. I know, Kyle said quietly, and I am asking you anyway. The morning after the bonding declaration, Vesna woke to find her world had tilted on its axis. Her narrow room in the servants' wing looked the same. Same cracked plaster ceiling, same thin blanket, same stack of ledgers on the desk. But everything felt different, charged with a terrifying electricity beneath her skin. She had not given him an answer. After his confession in the private study, after those words that had cracked her open, Kale had simply said, "Take whatever time you need." And Duvain had escorted her back to her room. A knock shattered the silence. Vesna opened it to find Mistress Orabel standing in the corridor with a tray of tea and an expression that said she already knew everything. Sit down, Orabel said, pushing past her. Good morning to you as well, Vesna managed. It is not a good morning. The entire court is in an uproar. Lord Greymarch is threatening to withdraw his border forces. Lady Thessaly has locked herself in her chambers, and you are at the center of all of it. Orabel set the tray down with a decisive clink. Tea? Vesna sat on the bed because her legs felt unreliable. Orabel poured 2 cups with steady hands. Half the court thinks he's lost his mind. The other half thinks you've bewitched him. She handed Vesna a cup. Now, tell me everything. Vesna told her. The overheard conversation, the ceremony, the private study. His words, delivered with a precision that suggested he'd been carrying them for a very long time. Orabel listened without interrupting, her tea growing cold in her hands. When Vesna finished, the healer was quiet for a long moment. He's been watching you for 2 years, Orabel said. It wasn't a question. That's what he said. And you've been watching him. Vesna's face burned. I have not been. Child? Orabel's voice was gentle but immovable. I raised you. I know where your eyes go when he enters a room. I've known for at least a year. Vesna had no response to that. She stared into her tea and wished the floor would open up. What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room, Orabel said, and the shift in her tone made Vesna's stomach drop. Orabel leaned forward, her expression grave. The king is not well. What do you mean? Since the Grey March campaign ended 18 months ago, something has been wrong with him. He hides it well. Duvain helps him hide it. But I treat the household, and I see things. Orabel's mouth thinned. He's losing control of his wolf. Vesna set down her tea. What? Small episodes at first. A flash of his eyes during council meetings. A growl he couldn't suppress. His wolf surfacing without his permission, unpredictably, at moments of stress or emotional pressure. Orabel paused. It's getting worse. The episodes are more frequent. Longer. More violent. Why? Vesna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because his wolf has identified its mate, Orabel said, looking directly at her. And he has been refusing to act on it for 2 years. The strain of denying a mate bond that strong for that long is tearing him apart from the inside. The room felt very small suddenly, very airless. He didn't choose you on a whim, Vesna, Orabel continued. He chose you because his wolf was going to destroy him if he didn't. The declaration last night wasn't romantic. It was a last resort. Vesna stared at her. He's dying? Orabel held her gaze. Not yet. But he will be, if the bond isn't completed. And soon. Vesna pressed her hands to her face, her trembling, utterly inadequate hands. So when he said I could take whatever time I needed, he was lying, Orabel said. He doesn't have time, but he would rather die than force you into something you don't want. A sound escaped Vesna's throat, halfway between a laugh and a sob. That absolute fool. Orabel almost smiled. Yes, that is a fair assessment of your future king. The door burst open. Duvain stood in the frame, his composure cracked in a way she had never seen before. His chest was heaving. His eyes were wide. Mistress Orabel, the beta said, we need you in the king's chambers. Now. What happened? Orabel was on her feet instantly. He shifted, Duvain said, and the controlled fear in his voice sent ice through Vesna's veins. During a private meeting with Lord Greymarch, involuntarily, full shift, he nearly took Greymarch's throat out before the guards restrained him. Orabel grabbed her medical bag from beneath the desk and moved toward the door. Vesna followed on instinct, but Duvain held up his hand. Not you, the beta said. It isn't safe. If his wolf is looking for its mate, Vesna said, and she had no idea where the steadiness in her voice came from, then I'm the safest person in this castle to be near him right now. Duvain stared at her. She's right, Orabel said from the corridor. Bring her. Chapter 3. The king's chambers smelled like blood and broken wood. A heavy oak table had been overturned and cracked nearly in half. Claw marks scored the stone floor in long, ragged lines. 3 guards stood at the perimeter of the room with their weapons drawn, their faces pale, and in the center of the destruction, Cale Ashenmere sat on the floor with his back against the far wall. He was human again, but barely. His shirt was torn, his hands were bloodied, though whether the blood was his own or someone else's, Vesna couldn't tell. His breathing came in deep, ragged pulls, and his eyes, when they found Vesna in the doorway, flashed gold before settling back to gray. His wolf. Right there, right behind his eyes, pressing forward. Everyone out, Orabel commanded. The guards hesitated. Now, the healer repeated, her voice leaving no room for argument. They filed out. Duvain remained by the door, his hand on the hilt of the short sword at his hip. Vesna didn't wait for permission. She crossed the room, stepping over the wreckage, and dropped to her knees in front of the king. Don't, Kyle said through clenched teeth. His body was rigid, every muscle locked down. Vesna, please. I can't control it right now. You won't hurt me, she said. You don't know that. I do, actually. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. The beat beneath her palm was savage, hammering so hard she could feel it vibrating through her arm. His wolf surged toward the contact. She felt it, a rush of heat and pressure and something feral and desperate that poured through the point where her skin met his. His breathing stuttered. The gold in his eyes flared bright, then dimmed, flared again. He was fighting it, fighting himself, and she could feel how much it was costing him. "Stop fighting," Vesna said softly. "If I stop fighting, I will shift. And if I shift right now, I don't know if I'll come back." "You'll come back," she said, and she moved her hand up to his face, cupping his jaw. His skin was burning. The stubble beneath her palm was rough, and his jaw clenched so hard under her touch that she felt the muscle jump. "How do you know?" he asked, and for the first time, the Alpha King of Valdmir sounded like a man who was terrified. "Because I'll be here," Vesna said. "And your wolf isn't trying to get away from me. It's trying to get to me." Something broke in his expression. The rigid control cracked, and beneath it she saw exhaustion so profound it made her chest ache. 2 years of holding this back. 2 years of watching her from across rooms and forcing his wolf down every single time because he thought she deserved better. His hand came up and covered hers. His fingers were bloodied, leaving dark smears across her knuckles. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw. "For all of this. For the ceremony. For putting you in front of the entire court without warning. For this." He gestured vaguely at the destroyed room. "This is not how I wanted you to find out." "How did you want me to find out?" Vesna asked. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "I had a plan. A proper one. I was going to speak to you privately first. Explain everything. Give you time to consider without the pressure of 200 witnesses." "What happened to the plan?" The almost laugh died. Greymarch forced the ceremony forward by 2 days. He announced his daughter's candidacy publicly and demanded an immediate declaration. If I'd refused to choose, it would have been read as weakness. The Northern Alliance would have fractured. He closed his eyes. "So I stood up in front of everyone with no warning, no preparation, and said your name. Because it was the only name I've ever wanted to say." Vesna's eyes burned. She blinked hard and focused on the blood drying on his knuckles. "Is Lord Greymarch all right?" she asked. Cale opened his eyes. "He'll live. I didn't actually reach him. Duvain tackled me, which I'm sure he'll remind me of for the rest of our lives." Behind them, Duvain made a sound that confirmed this. Orabelle knelt beside them, her medical bag open, and began cleaning the king's hands with a practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time she'd tended wounds after an involuntary shift. She worked in silence for a few minutes, then spoke without looking up. "Your Majesty, how long between episodes now?" Cale's jaw tightened. 6 hours, sometimes less. Orabelle's hands stilled briefly. Then she resumed cleaning, her expression carefully controlled. "And the duration of each episode?" "Longer," Kyle said. "Today was nearly 10 minutes before I regained control." "That's twice what it was last month," Duvain said from the doorway, and the worry in his voice was unmistakable. Orabelle sat back on her heels and looked at Vesna. The look said everything her words didn't. 6 hours between episodes, 10 minutes of lost control. Getting worse. Vesna understood. Whatever decision she was going to make, she needed to make it now. Not in days, not in hours. Now. She looked at Cale, at the blood on his hands and the exhaustion carved into his face and the way his wolf was still pressing forward behind his gray eyes, still reaching for her, patient and desperate and certain in a way that made her throat close. "I have conditions," Vesna said. Cale blinked at her. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "Conditions," he repeated. 3 of them. She held up her ink-stained fingers. First, I keep my position in the archive. I'm not giving up my work to sit on a throne and smile. Second, you tell me the truth about everything. Your wolf, the episodes, the politics, all of it. No more protecting me from information I need. She paused. Third, you let me help you. Actually help you. Not from across a room, not from a safe distance. You let me close enough to matter. The room was silent except for the fire and the distant sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows. Kale looked at her like she was the most terrifying and miraculous thing he had ever encountered. Those are your conditions, he said. Yes. You want to keep cataloging grain shipments. They're important. The corner of his mouth twitched. Then it twitched again. And then Kale Ashenmere, the Alpha King of Valdmere, the man whose involuntary shift had nearly killed a lord less than an hour ago, laughed. It was brief and rough and slightly broken, but it was real, and the sound of it did something to Vesna's chest that she knew she would never recover from. Accepted, he said. All three. Vesna nodded, trying to look composed and failing completely. Good. Now let Orabel finish cleaning your hands. You're bleeding on the floor. It's my floor, the king said. It's still a mess. Behind them, Orabel caught Duvane's eye. The beta's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had shifted. A fraction of the tension releasing from his shoulders like a breath held too long finally let go. Vesna stayed while Orabel worked. She sat beside the king on the cold stone floor of his wrecked chambers, their shoulders almost touching, and felt the frantic hammering of her own heart slowly begin to ease. His wolf settled. She could feel it, a gradual quieting, like a storm pulling back from shore. The gold faded from his eyes entirely, leaving only gray. His breathing steadied, his hands unclenched. He didn't touch her. He didn't reach for her or close the distance between them. But when she glanced sideways, she found him watching her with an expression so unguarded, so nakedly grateful, that she had to look away before she started crying in front of the beta and the head healer and the king of the realm. She stared at the claw marks scored into the stone floor and thought about what she'd just agreed to. Then a knock came at the door. Duvane opened it to reveal a palace messenger, ashen-faced and out of breath. My lord, the messenger said to Duvane, Lord Greymarch has convened an emergency session of the noble houses. He's calling for a formal challenge to the king's bonding declaration. The messenger swallowed. He's invoking the right of contention. The temperature in the room dropped. Vesna didn't know what the right of contention was, but the look on Duvane's face told her everything she needed to know. Beside her, Kyle went rigid, and when she turned to look at him, his eyes had gone gold again. Chapter 4. The right of contention was older than the castle itself. Duvane explained it to Vesna in clipped, controlled sentences as they followed the king down the corridor toward the council chamber. Any lord of standing could invoke it if he believed a bonding declaration violated the interests of the realm. Once invoked, the challenge could only be resolved in one of two ways. The king could withdraw his declaration, or he could defend it in a trial before the assembled noble houses. What kind of trial? Vesna asked, her voice tight. A formal hearing, Duvane said. Lord Greymarch will present his case for why the declaration should be annulled. The king will present his. The noble houses will vote. And if the vote goes against us? Duvane's silence was answer enough. The council chamber was already full when they arrived. Lords and ladies packed the tiered benches, their faces sharp with anticipation. The air smelled like sweat and ambition. Lord Greymarch stood at the center of the floor, a tall man with iron-gray hair and the kind of lean, wolfish build that spoke of a life spent in borderland campaigns. His daughter Thessaly sat behind him, her face composed into perfect glacial stillness. Kale took his seat at the head of the chamber. Vesna was directed to a chair along the wall, close enough to see but far enough to feel the distance like a physical thing. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to keep them from shaking. "Your Majesty," Lord Greymarch began, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "I invoke the right of contention not out of personal ambition, but out of duty to this realm." "Noted," Kale said, his voice flat. Greymarch was not deterred. "The bonding of the Alpha King is not a private matter. It is an act of state. The Queen will bear the heir to this throne. She will represent Valdemir to every kingdom beyond our borders. She will stand beside you in council and in war." He paused, letting the words settle. "With the greatest respect, Your Majesty, a record keeper from the servants' wing is not equipped for that burden." Vesna felt every eye in the room shift to her. She stared at a point on the far wall and focused on breathing. "Furthermore," Greymarch continued, "the northern territories have guarded this kingdom's border for 3 generations. My house has bled for the crown. My daughter has been raised from birth for exactly this role." He gestured toward Thessaly. "The alliance our families would forge through this bond would strengthen Valdemir for decades. What does the crown gain from bonding with a woman who has no name, no family, and no standing?" The chamber was silent. Vesna could hear the candle flames guttering. Kale stood. The movement was slow and deliberate, and the room contracted around him. "You ask what the crown gains," he said. "I'll tell you what the crown loses if I bond with someone my wolf does not recognize." He let the silence hold for 3 beats. "Control," he said. "Stability. My ability to lead this kingdom without destroying it from within." The murmurs started instantly. Kale raised a hand and they died. "My wolf has identified its mate. That is not a choice I made. It is not a political calculation. It is a biological reality that every shifter in this room understands, whether they want to admit it or not." His gaze swept the chamber. "Denying a true mate bond doesn't make it disappear. It makes the wolf feral, unpredictable, dangerous." He paused. "Ask the guards who restrained me this morning whether you want an unbonded, destabilizing alpha on the throne." The room went airless. Several lords exchanged uneasy glances. Even Greymarch's composure flickered. "You're saying you have no choice," Greymarch said carefully. "I'm saying I have one choice," Kale replied. "And I've made it." The vote was called. Vesna sat motionless as the lords and ladies deliberated in tight, whispering clusters. She watched their faces and tried to read the outcome in the set of their jaws, the angle of their shoulders, the way certain lords leaned toward Greymarch while others pulled back. She watched Thessaly's face across the chamber and saw something she didn't expect. Not fury, not humiliation, something quieter and more complex. Something that looked almost like relief. The first votes came in. 3 for Greymarch, then 2 for the king, then 3 more for the king. The numbers seesawed back and forth, and with each announcement Vesna felt her pulse spike and settle and spike again. The final tally split 11-7 in Kale's favor. The right of contention was denied. Greymarch accepted the result with rigid dignity, bowed stiffly, and left the chamber with his daughter. The room emptied slowly, the nobles filing out with the careful neutrality of people who had just witnessed something they needed time to process. Vesna didn't move until the chamber was nearly empty. Then Kale crossed the room to where she sat. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "That was awful." Something softened in his expression. "Yes, it was." He offered her his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, at the scarred knuckles and the calluses and the size of it, and then she took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, and the contact sent a quiet shock through her chest. He walked her back to her room in silence, their joined hands hidden in the fold between them. At her door, he released her carefully. "Tomorrow," he said. "Will you come to the archive? I have something to show you." Vesna searched his face. "What is it?" Something I should have shown you a long time ago." He left before she could ask what he meant. Vesna stood in her doorway, her hand still warm from his grip, and felt the first fragile thread of hope weaving itself between her ribs. Then she closed the door and pressed her back against it, and the hope shattered into panic. Because she'd just survived a formal challenge from the most powerful lord in the Northern Territories, and the look on Greymarch's face as he'd left the chamber hadn't been defeat. It had been patience. Chapter 5. The archive room was Vesna's territory. She knew every shelf, every drawer, every water-stained corner where the roof leaked during heavy rain. She knew which floorboard creaked near the eastern window and which candle brackets threw the best reading light. It was the one place in Ironholt where she felt competent and sure and entirely herself. Finding the Alpha King standing in the middle of it the next morning felt like a violation of natural law. Kale looked enormous in the small room, his shoulders nearly brushing the shelves on either side. He stood before the long table where Vesna usually worked, and spread across its surface were documents she had never seen before. Old ones. The parchment was yellowed and brittle at the edges, the ink faded to rust. "What is this?" Vesna asked from the doorway. "Your history," Kyle said. Her stomach dropped. She moved closer, drawn forward despite the dread pooling in her chest. The documents were records. Census records, healer's notes, trade manifests, and at the center, a single sheet of parchment bearing a seal she didn't recognize. A crescent moon bisected by a thorn branch. "Duvain found these 6 months ago," Kale said quietly, watching her face. "In the sealed archives beneath the North Tower, records that were supposed to have been destroyed 20 years ago." Vesna stared at the crescent seal. Something stirred in her memory, faint and formless, like a word she'd forgotten how to pronounce. "You were not abandoned," Kale said. "You were hidden." The room tilted. Vesna gripped the edge of the table. "Your mother's name was Idrene Vale. She was a healer in a settlement called Thornfeld, on the eastern edge of the Greymarch territories." He paused, and his voice gentled in a way she'd never heard before. "She brought you to this castle herself. Left you on the steps with a letter that Orabel kept hidden for 23 years. "Orabel knew?" Vesna's voice came out strangled. "She was protecting you. Your mother asked her to." "Protecting me from what?" Kale's jaw tightened. "From the same people who destroyed Thornfeld 3 months after you arrived here. The settlement was burned. No survivors." Vesna's knees buckled. She caught herself on the table, her fingers white against the wood. The room was spinning. She was aware of Kale moving toward her, of his hand hovering near her arm, not touching, waiting. "Why?" she managed. "Why would anyone destroy a settlement of healers?" "Because your mother wasn't just a healer," Kale said. "She was a seer, a wolf with the gift of true sight. She could see bonds before they formed. She could read the threads that connected mates across distances." He paused. "It's an extraordinarily rare gift, Vesna, and extraordinarily dangerous to anyone who wants to control who bonds with whom." The implication settled over her like cold water. She looked up at him, her vision blurring. "Greymarch," she whispered. Kale's expression confirmed it. "Thornfeld was in Greymarch territory. Lord Greymarch's father ordered the burning. We believe he discovered what your mother could do, and feared she would expose the arranged bonds he'd been engineering across the northern houses for decades. Political matches disguised as true bonds." Vesna pressed her palms flat against the table and tried to steady her breathing. Her entire life, her foundling's identity, her namelessness, her invisibility, had been a shield. Placed around her by a mother she'd never known to protect her from a man whose son had stood in the council chamber yesterday and tried to annul her bond with the king. "Does Greymarch know who I am?" she asked. "Not yet," Kale said. "But if he discovers it, if he connects you to Thornfeld and to your mother's gift—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Do I have it? Vesna asked, her voice barely audible. The gift. The true sight. Kyle looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. You tell me, he said. You've always known things about people before they told you. You've always seen connections others miss. You thought it was intuition. Good observational skills. Pattern recognition. He paused. It's not. Vesna stared at him. And somewhere beneath the shock and the grief and the fear, a door opened inside her mind that had always been locked, and behind it was a rushing golden warmth that poured through her like sunlight through glass. She could see it. The thread. The bond. A shimmering cord of light connecting her chest to his, pulsing gently with every breath they shared. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I can see it, she whispered. The bond. Ours. I can see it. Cale's composure cracked. He reached for her then, pulling her against his chest, and she pressed her face into the hollow of his throat and wept for a mother she'd never known, and a gift she'd carried her whole life without understanding. His arms tightened around her. His chin rested on the top of her head. She could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, strong and steady and fast. I'm sorry, he said into her hair. I should have told you sooner. I wanted to wait until the right was resolved. I was trying to protect you. Vesna pulled back and looked up at him, her eyes red, her cheeks wet. You keep trying to protect me. Stop it. I told you. Let me close enough to matter. The look he gave her was so raw it stole her breath. He lifted his hand and wiped the tears from her face with his thumb, his touch impossibly gentle for hands that had ended wars. You matter, he said. You have always mattered. The archive room was silent except for their breathing and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Vesna stood in his arms, her face against his chest, and felt the golden thread between them pulse with something that felt like the beginning of everything. Then the door opened. Duvain stood in the frame, his face white. Your Majesty, he said, Lord Greymarch has left the castle. He's ridden north with his full retinue. Cale stiffened. When? Within the hour. But that isn't why I'm here. Duvain swallowed. Before he left, Lady Thessaly requested a private audience with me. She gave me this. He held out a folded letter. Cale took it, read it, and the color drained from his face. What does it say? Vesna asked. Cale handed her the letter. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and the message was 3 lines long. My father knows about Thornfeld. He knows about the girl's mother. He has been searching for the seer's bloodline for 20 years, and now he knows exactly where to find it. Vesna read it twice. The words didn't change. She looked up at Kyle, and his eyes were gold again. Chapter 6. The days that followed moved with the speed and weight of an avalanche. Cale convened his war council. Duvain doubled the guard on the castle perimeter. Riders were dispatched to every allied house in the southern and western territories, with sealed messages requesting reinforcements. Vesna was moved from her room in the servants' wing to chambers adjacent to the king's quarters. She didn't argue. The political implications were secondary to the simple, undeniable fact that the closer she stayed to Cale, the calmer his wolf remained, and the farther she strayed, the worse it got. She learned this the hard way. 3 days after Greymarch's departure, Vesna spent the afternoon in the lower infirmary helping Orabelle prepare field medicines for the border patrols. She was gone for 4 hours. When she returned to the upper corridors, she found claw marks in the stone outside Cale's door, and Duvain sitting on the floor with a split lip. What happened? Vesna demanded. You were gone too long, Duvain said, pressing a cloth to his mouth. He had an episode, a bad one. Took 3 guards and myself to hold him. Guilt hit her like a fist. I was just downstairs. His wolf doesn't care about geography, Duvain replied. It cares about proximity. When you're near, he's stable. When you're not, The window is getting shorter. How short? Vesna asked, dreading the answer. 3 hours. Maybe 4. Down from 6 last week. The numbers were a countdown, and the clock was accelerating. Vesna pressed her hand to the claw marks on the wall and felt their depth beneath her fingertips. Deep. Desperate. She went inside. Kale was sitting on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. He didn't look up when she entered. His shirt was torn again. His breathing was rough and uneven. Vesna crossed the room and sat beside him without speaking. She placed her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, and felt the tremor running through him. His wolf was right there, right beneath the surface, pressing toward her touch with a need so raw it made her eyes sting. "I'm here," she said. "I know." His voice was hoarse. "I could feel you coming back. I could feel the distance closing." He turned his head slightly, not enough to look at her, just enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his profile. "It's getting worse, Vesna." "I know. If we don't complete the bond soon." He paused. "I don't want to hurt anyone." The word complete hung in the air between them, heavy with everything it implied. "Kale," Vesna said, and his name felt new in her mouth, intimate and terrifying. "Look at me." He turned. His eyes were gray again, but barely, the gold flickering at the edges like embers refusing to die. She could see the war happening behind them, the man fighting the wolf, the king fighting the instinct, the lover fighting the fear of taking something he hadn't earned. "You're not going to hurt me," she said. "You don't know that." "I do know that. Because I can see the bond. I can see exactly what your wolf wants. And it isn't violence. It isn't possession. It's just me." His breath caught. She watched his throat work. "My mother could see bonds," Vesna continued, her voice steady even as her heart raced. "She had the gift of true sight. And I have it too. I've always had it. I just didn't know what I was looking at." She lifted her hand from his back and placed it on his chest, over his heart. "I can see the thread that connects us. It's golden. It pulses when we're close. And right now it's brighter than anything I've ever seen in my life." Kale covered her hand with his. His palm was hot, his grip fierce. "If we do this," he said, his voice rough, "there's no going back. The bond will be permanent. You'll be tied to me, to this throne, to everything that comes with it." "I know. Your life will never be simple again." "My life stopped being simple the moment you said my name in front of 200 people." He almost smiled. "I suppose it did." They looked at each other across the impossible space of 6 inches. Vesna could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, could feel the bond thrumming between them like a plucked string, could feel her wolf rising to meet his with a certainty that went deeper than thought. "I have one more condition," she said. Kale blinked. "Another one?" "You keep letting me work in the archive." This time he did smile, brief and crooked and devastating. "Vesna, I'm serious. The kingdom runs on accurate numbers, and nobody else catches the errors I catch." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. "Accepted," he whispered. Then he kissed her. It was slow at first. Careful. His hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that made her ache. She felt the bond flare between them, golden and warm. She kissed him back, pulling him closer, and a low sound rumbled through his chest that was part man and part wolf, and entirely hers. They fell into each other with the desperate relief of 2 people who had been holding themselves apart for far too long. When the mating bite came, instinctive and inevitable, the bond locked into place with a force that took Vesna's breath away. She felt it settle in her chest like a second heartbeat. She felt him through it, every emotion laid bare. The relief, the joy, the staggering depth of feeling he had carried in silence for 2 years, and beneath all of it, a gratitude so profound it made her weep. She bit him back, marking him as hers, and felt the bond complete itself with a brightness that filled the room like sunrise. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his arm locked around her waist. His breathing was deep and even. His wolf was silent. For the first time since the mountain wars, Kale Ashenmere was at peace. Vesna traced the mating mark on his neck with her fingertip and felt a fierce, primal satisfaction that surprised her. "Mine," she murmured. "Yours," he agreed, his voice sleepy and rough. "Along with the grain ledgers." She laughed softly, and his arm tightened around her. She closed her eyes and let sleep pull her under, warm and safe and whole in a way she had never known. She woke in the dark to find her gift screaming. The golden thread that connected her to Kale was blazing, pulsing with a frantic urgency that drove her upright in bed. But it wasn't their bond that had woken her. It was the others. Threads she had never noticed before were suddenly visible, hundreds of them, stretching outward from the castle in every direction like a web of light. And one by one, they were going dark. Vesna pressed her hand to her mouth. She could see it now, see what her mother must have seen before Thornfeld burned. The bonds across the northern territories, the arranged matches that Greymarch had engineered for decades, were being severed. Cut. Deliberately and systematically, like someone was pulling threads from a tapestry. And in the distance, moving toward Ironholt through the darkness, she could feel him. Lord Greymarch, coming with an army and a purpose, and 20 years of secrets he would kill to protect. She turned to wake Kale and found his eyes already open, gold burning in the dark. "I know," he said. "I can feel it too." Chapter 7. They moved through the castle like two halves of the same thought. Kale issued orders to Duvain while Vesna followed at his shoulder, her gift blazing behind her eyes, mapping the web of dying threads that stretched across the kingdom like a failing nervous system. "How many?" Kyle asked as they descended toward the war room. Vesna closed her eyes and reached outward. The bonds flickered in her vision, hundreds of golden threads radiating in every direction. Some burned steady, others guttered. In the north, a spreading darkness where threads had gone cold. 14 severed, she said. All in the Greymarch territories. All arranged bonds, not true ones. Kale's jaw tightened. He's cutting his own people loose. No, Vesna said, understanding flooding through her. He's cutting the evidence. Every false bond his father engineered, every political match that was dressed up as fate. He's destroying the proof before anyone with true sight can expose the pattern. They reached the war room. Duvain was already there, bent over maps, candles throwing long shadows. Greymarch's forces are 2 days out, Duvain reported. 800 wolves, battle-hardened. Our strength? 500 in the garrison. Western reinforcements are 4 days away. The arithmetic was brutal. Vesna didn't need to be a military strategist to understand it. They were outnumbered, and help was too far away. There's another option, Vesna said. Every head turned toward her. She felt the weight of their attention, the skepticism of the captains, the careful patience of Duvain, the fierce protective focus of Kale. The arranged bonds, she continued. Greymarch is severing them because they're his vulnerability, but he hasn't reached all of them yet. There are dozens of wolves in the northern houses who believe their bonds are real, who built their lives around matches that were never true. She paused, letting the implication settle. If I can reach them first, if I can show them the truth, they won't fight for Greymarch. They'll turn against the man who stole their right to a real bond. The war room was silent. You're suggesting we ride north, Duvain said slowly, into enemy territory, toward an approaching army, to tell people their marriages are lies. I'm suggesting we tell them the truth and let them decide what to do with it. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Through the bond, she could feel his fear for her safety warring with his recognition that she was right. "How?" he asked. "How would you show them?" Vesna lifted her hand. The air between her fingers shimmered, and a thread of gold appeared, visible to everyone in the room. It hung in the air like a strand of sunlight, pulsing gently, connecting her chest to Kale's in an unbroken line. The captain stared. Duvane's eyes widened. "I can see every bond in this kingdom," Vesna said, "real and false. I can see which threads are golden and which are gray, and I can show others what I see." She closed her hand and the thread vanished. "Your mother's gift," Orabel said from the doorway. No one had heard her enter. The healer stood with her arms crossed, her expression caught between awe and worry. She could do the same thing. "It's what got her killed." "It's what got Thornfeld killed," Vesna corrected quietly. "Because one man was afraid of the truth. I'm not going to let that fear win." Kyle stood. "Duvane, prepare a riding party. Small, fast. 6 wolves, no more." "Your Majesty," Duvane began. "I'm going with her," Kale said, and his tone closed the discussion. They rode out before dawn. 6 wolves on fast horses cutting north through the forests that bordered the Greymarch lowlands. Vesna rode beside Kale, her gift stretched wide, reading the landscape of bonds like a map only she could see. They reached the first settlement by midday, a village called Ashenwick, where a lord named Fenrath had bonded with a woman from a rival house 3 decades earlier. A match that had united 2 warring families and secured Greymarch's control over a critical trade route. Vesna stood before them in the village square, Kale at her back, and raised her hands and showed them the truth. The bond between Lord Fenrath and his mate was gray, lifeless, a manufactured thread with no warmth, no pulse. Beside it, thin and barely visible, 2 other threads reached outward from each of them toward people they had never been allowed to meet, their true mates. A hush fell over the square, heavy and absolute. Lord Fenrath's wife sank to her knees. The Lord himself stood rigid, his face white, 30 years of his life rewritten in a single moment. "I'm sorry," Vesna said, and she meant it with everything she had. They visited 3 more settlements that day. At each one, the story repeated. False bonds exposed, true bonds revealed. Shock, grief, rage, and beneath it all, a growing fury directed at the man who had stolen their choices from them. By nightfall, word was spreading faster than they could ride. Runners carried the news from village to village. Greymarch's carefully constructed web of alliances was unraveling from the inside. On the second morning, as they prepared to ride for the next settlement, a scout galloped into camp with news that changed everything. "Greymarch has diverted," the scout reported, breathless. "He's not marching on Ironholt anymore. He's coming here, for you." Vesna felt Kyle's hand tighten on her shoulder. "How long?" Kyle asked. "Hours, maybe less." They didn't run. Kale positioned his 6 wolves at the edge of the settlement and sent word to the villages they'd already visited. By the time Greymarch's force crested the northern ridge, the 6 had become 60. Wolves from every settlement where Vesna had revealed the truth, standing shoulder to shoulder with their king. And behind them, more were coming. Greymarch halted his army at the ridgeline. Even from a distance, Vesna could see the calculation on his face as he counted the wolves arrayed against him. Kale walked forward alone. Vesna felt the bond stretch between them, taut and golden, as he crossed the open ground. "Greymarch," Kale called, "your father built his power on stolen bonds. You've spent your life protecting that secret. It's over." Lord Greymarch dismounted. Something had shifted in his bearing. The confidence had thinned. "You think a few parlor tricks from your little seer will undo 3 generations of alliance?" Greymarch said, but his voice lacked the resonance it had carried in the council chamber. "They already have," Cale replied. A murmur ran through Greymarch's own forces. Wolves glancing at each other. Wolves who had heard the rumors from the settlements. Wolves who were beginning to wonder about their own bonds. Vesna stepped forward. She raised her hands and let the gift pour through her. The air above the field filled with light. Hundreds of threads made visible, golden and gray, true and false. A map of every bond in the Northern Territories laid bare for all to see. The gray threads stood out like scars, engineered connections binding wolves to mates they had never truly chosen. And beside each one, the faint golden shimmer of a true bond that had been suppressed. Greymarch's army fractured. Wolves dropped their weapons. Others turned to face Greymarch with expressions that needed no translation. Lord Greymarch stood alone on the field, surrounded by the ruins of everything his family had built. His daughter Thessaly walked forward from somewhere in the ranks and stood beside him, and the look she gave him was the saddest thing Vesna had ever seen. "Father," Thessaly said quietly, "it's over." Greymarch looked at his daughter, looked at the field of broken alliances and abandoned weapons, looked at Kyle, standing with his bonded mate at his side, the golden thread between them burning so bright it cast shadows. He knelt, not to the king, to his daughter, and the sound he made was the sound of a man whose lies had finally outlived him. Epilogue. The weeks that followed were not easy. False bonds dissolved across the Northern Territories. True mates were sought and found across distances that should have been impossible. Some reunions were joyful, others were complicated by years built on manufactured foundations. Vesna worked through all of it, sitting with the displaced mates, helping them see their true threads. Cale was beside her for every one of them. Thessaly Greymarch became an unexpected ally, negotiating the peaceful transition of the Northern Territories. When Vesna asked why she'd sent that warning letter, Thessaly's answer was simple. "Because my father arranged my bond too, and I wanted to know if it was real." It wasn't, but the thread that reached from Thessaly toward a blacksmith's apprentice in the western provinces was golden and full of possibility. Her mother's legacy, hidden for 23 years, was finally doing what it was meant to do. On a quiet evening months later, Vesna sat at her desk, ink on her fingers, a candle burning low. Cale appeared in the doorway, watching her. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I've been staring for 2 years. You only just started noticing." She smiled. He crossed the room and placed his hand over hers on the ledger, his fingers covering the ink stains she'd stopped trying to scrub away. "Come to bed," he said. 5 more minutes." Kyle pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "Then I'll wait." He did, and when she finally closed the ledger and extinguished the candle, they walked back to their chambers together, hand in hand, through the quiet corridors of a castle that had become, against all odds and expectations, her home.